this out of the way from the top. This is not a Valkyria Chronicles game. And I mean that it's no disrespect to the game itself, or the series that it's not a part of. Or is a part of because it's more of a... Just start the review.
One of the more recent and refreshing tactical RPG series to date, Valkyria Chronicles is an original blend of turn-based tactics with real-time battles whose gameplay is far more involved than many of its contemporaries, be they games that came out before or since the original's release. Admittedly, my time with the original isn't as extensive as I'd like it to be, but what I have played of it showcased some of the more engaging gameplay of any modern tactical RPG, and the sequel is a smart conversion of Chronicles core into a more pick-up-and-play approach to design that perfectly suits the PSP. Could have done without the high school setting, but I digress. Valkyria Revolution is nothing like the Chronicles games that came before it. Dropping the tactics and turn-based gameplay in favor of a more traditional JRPG experience, Valkyria Revolution is almost unrecognizable as a Valkyria game, which is part of the reason why this new entry was not received with open arms in Japan, not helped by a demo that, shall we say, did not alleviate any initial concerns for those who played it. That being said, the project wasn't necessarily doomed from the start. The developer behind this particular revolution was Media Vision, a talented studio most well known for the Wild Arms series, and for their work on, as of this recording, the unlocalized Valkyria Chronicles 3, plus the soundtrack was composed by Yasunori Mitsuda of Xenogears fame. Also, some title about chronology or something, I don't know. However, it is hard to deny that this new game was fighting an uphill battle.
What I'm saying is that, given the radical departure in the gameplay and storytelling departments, among other changes in design, and lack of continuity with the original trilogy, it's best to treat Valkyria Revolution as a spin-off of sorts, not the next main entry in the series, because, well, it was never intended to be the next main entry in the series, and it isn't.
So, did the Valkyria series make a successful jump into a new genre with this revolution? Let's find out.
The Kingdom of Jutland, September 15th, 1954 EC.
The story opens with a historian recounting the history of the traitors.
You mean the traitor?
Traitor.
Oh, no. We are not doing this again. Absolutely not. No.
All joking aside, these particular traitors are Jutland citizens who share a tragic backstory, one that eventually finds them starting a war with the powerful Ruse Empire as a means of revenge against the Emperor for his previous transgressions. Ruse, who placed a blockade on the Kingdom of Jutland, are besieged by a successful campaign, courtesy of the commander of Jutland's forces and Jutland's anti-Valkyria unit, Amleth, the leader of the traitors, who is searching for a woman named Maria, and taking vengeance on the ones who took her away from him. Insert Shadow the Hedgehog joke here. Their success is short-lived when the Empire employs the aid of a powerful Valkyria in order to put an end to Jutland's fledgling revolution and the traitors that started it. Thus, Am and his companions must contend with the Empire's vast forces while fulfilling their squad's intended goals of trumping the tide-turning power of the Valkyria. Conceptually, the plot is straightforward enough, if not particularly original, but the end result is a rough draft in desperate need of a rewrite. The pacing is exceptionally slow, so little substance happens from chapter to chapter that by the time anything significant does occur, any interest in the ongoing events has long since evaporated. It's done no favors by a lead who can be best described as brooding boredom incarnate, with their generic troubled past, insatiable desire for revenge, and general apathy towards anything or anyone that stands in the way of their precious plans. Not that the rest of the cast has much in the way of endearment, packing their paper-thin personalities on top of a pile of tiresome cliches made all the worse thanks to Revolution's tendency to forcefully drill in their single defining characteristic over and over again in every conversation. The only exception to this is Laertes. Their struggle to hold on to their morals while working for an empire wholly devoid of such isn't quite the Shakespearean tragedy that the game constantly likes to quote, but it's the closest that Valkyria Revolution comes to boasting a compelling character. However, even they're not immune to blurting out prequel levels of dialogue among the increasingly repetitive conversations.
From the Absarian's point of view, the head has only changed from Ruse to Jutland.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
That is hubris, Princess. The Absaria of old, its country, its people, was weak. That was why they lost to Ruse. Nothing more, nothing less.
Don't lecture me, Obi-Wan. I see through the lies of the Jedi. I do not fear the dark side as you do.
Stay your tongue!
Your Highness.
I don't want to hear any more about Obi-Wan.
I am no king. I am Grand General Maxime of the Rusi Empire, a man who has sworn allegiance to Emperor Claudius.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
I don't know what the future will bring, but I shall wield my strength for the sake of this man.
I pledge myself to your teachings.
There is so much exposition. Over 75% of the entire game is comprised of cutscenes, the vast majority of which repeat the same information to the point of redundancy. Oh, the blockade is causing problems for Jutland and its people? How interesting! Let me take a mental note of that for the 99th time. I joked about Revolution's resemblance to Lost Dimension, but it's truly reminiscent of the very worst aspects of the latter game's story. The terribly written characters, the dialogue being on a loop, and the generally dreadfully dull writing. This might seem minor given the gargantuan garbage heap of a plot on display, but the game never capitalizes on saying anything meaningful about its obvious inspiration, the Industrial Revolution, one of the most significant periods in modern human history. Characters have roles that mirror occupations of the time like the printing press, but there's very little in the way of commentary about its significance in the time period. Whereas the original Chronicles aped World War II to give a surprisingly rare depiction of concentration camps and comment about the destructive actions of the Axis forces, VR does nothing with its ire-inspired setting, treating it like a mere background element with little significance in the overall story. What few credits that exist can only be given with the backhanded acknowledgement of the many faults that accompany them. While much of the design for the women are objectified to varying degrees, even for the series, the Valkyria's breasts are comedically oversized. It's gotta be bad for their back. At least they're given agency over their actions, save for the Valkyria herself.
Remember, you only need to follow my command. Our command.
I shall comply, mortal. I shall sing whenever you wish it. There is nothing more for me.
And the inclusion of the women in refrigerators trope by way of Marie existing as nothing more than a means to motivate the main characters, especially Am, into enacting their revenge. Worst of all, the direction for nearly all cutscenes makes Ed Wood look like Stanley Kubrick, with the mixture of incompetence and questionable decisions on constant display. Why is the camera being pulled so far away for what's supposed to be a more personal and intimate moment between these two characters? Just as an example, and a minor spoiler, skip to here if you want to avoid it. 3, 2, 1, go. During a moment of weakness for Amleth, the Valkyria attempts to take his life. A character named Godot steps in to save Am from the blow, and apparently he forgets that he had a shield since he just stands there in front of him with his arms wide open. Why did he not just use his shield to block the attack or attempt to push Am out of the way? Couldn't he have parried the attack with his sword? Or anything but this? The answer is simple. The game script required a sad moment, and this was the way they felt was best to render this particular scene. This manipulative, contrived, nonsensical scene. Instead of adding to what should be a tragic outcome, with Am's indecisiveness costing one of his troops their lives, this incompetent directing depicts so laughable a visual in contrast to what was originally intended.
Thank you, Captain. Jutland's future is in your hands now.
Would you get out of here?
Revolution's plot is a poorly put together and pitifully told mess that meanders through the same handful of scenes to the point of irritation. And though it may encompass the majority of this unpleasant experience, it's not the sole portion of this game that contributes to a chronicle's worth of terrible decisions. Valkyria Revolution's gameplay has one major draw. Mixing in an ATB system for actions like basic attacks and skills, a la Final Fantasy IV, and real-time movement, with a war gauge that impacts the overall speed of which the meter will recharge. The higher the war gauge, the faster the ATB meter recharges, with the gauge itself changing based on the number of defeated foes or bases captured in a given mission. It's a novel concept to frame the missions around, i.e. showcasing how the battle shifts in favor of one side to the other. However, much like the story, the execution is what makes this mixture of ideas execrable. Problem number 1. The gauge has far too profound an impact on the recharge rate. It gets to the point where the game feels more like an action RPG rather than a hybrid, given that attacks become instantaneous and immensely easy to spam. Problem number 2. The higher the gauge for a given side, the more likely the opposing side will be hit by static conditions like fear, which, in the case of enemy units, puts them in such a state where they will not attack and may even flee, making the threat that they originally opposed non-existent. Couple these factors with the aforementioned frequency of attacks, and most main missions become broken in terms of difficulty, which is to say there is none because all you'll be doing is spamming the same attacks without any sort of opposition. Problem number 3. The war gauge almost never decreases for the player. Once it's full, there's next to no reason to worry about it decreasing to a point where it could cause problems. Even during defense missions where a captured base will cause it to continually decline, the rate at which it drops is so staggeringly slow that you can simply ignore it and any of the invaders while you wail on the nearby bases and capture them as well, not to mention that any defeated foes thrown your way instantly refill what little has been lost upon defeat. Problem number 4. The gameplay never evolves over the course of this considerably lengthy game. It fails to become interesting over that time period. It does not invoke any sense of satisfaction from successfully overtaking your foes, mostly because of how blisteringly bad the enemy AI can be. You might as well let your allies take care of things while you sit back and, take a break, get yourself a cup of tea, maybe catch up on some reading, or find a more entertaining game to play.
The combat is so unengaging that, if I may be frank, I spend the vast majority of my time in missions playing on my 3DS, occasionally peeking up at the screen to move my units to the next goal once all enemies on the screen were cleared. Now, you might say that's mighty unprofessional of me, to which I would reply, what channel do you think you're watching exactly? Also, it's not a good sign when I feel my time is better spent playing another game while treating Valkyria Revolution like it's background noise at best.
The only time any meaningful input is required during these excruciatingly dull encounters on the player's part is during the occasional solo missions for self-explanatory reasons, or one of the bosses because, well, your allies tend to run straight into their attacks. Yeah, the AI is terrible on both fronts. It's just that the ally AI is slightly less terrible. That said, the bosses aren't exactly the Stephen Hawking of strategy. It's just that draining away their bloated health bars and getting rid of the endless pawns they spawn, to say nothing of their movement patterns or the often frustrating methods required to beat them, is tedious to a T. One of the earlier bosses you'll encounter is this flying tank, which has a tendency to fly out of the range of your attacks and attack you from afar, only coming within range to drop a handful of generic foes that extend this already prolonged assault. The time this boss takes to defeat would be decimated if not for the fact that they habitually fly out of range of your normal attacks, since the best strategy for these bosses tends to be spam skills and spells until down, and with few actions that can reach them, have highly limited usage. Rather than skill, the only ability that any of these bosses tests is one's patience for these titanic time sinks. The final straw for me was the second encounter with the two-headed snake tank, because in addition to being on challenging slogs, Valkyria Revolution recycles bosses for peak extraneousness. There are two main ways to damage the boss, those being the left and right heads. Since the right one has such high defenses, one would think the best strategy would be to focus on the left one. Problem is, their health recovers to half whenever it gets low, and continues to regenerate no matter how much damage is dealt. That is until you attack the other head.
What?
Yes, you have to destroy both heads in order to defeat this boss. The only indication, the only hint that you're given that you're supposed to destroy both heads is a short line that occasionally pops up that's quickly drawn out by the dozen of constantly regurgitated quips from your forces. That is the only feedback, the only hint that the player is given in order to figure out how to take down this boss. A boss whose weakness is not consistent with their appearance in a previous mission, given that only one head was needed to be destroyed in order to complete it, nor is it consistent with the usual strategy that other bosses or previous fought foes typically require. Speaking of the UI, it's a nightmare to navigate, and the loading times are confoundingly long, both of which add layers to the overall tedium that one should expect from Valkyria Revolution. It's difficult to think of a single component that Valkyria Revolution doesn't thoroughly butcher. Why would I buy spells when I can get better ones for missions, aside from using them as cheap upgrade fodder? Why do I have to mainly go through each reward instead of receiving them all at once? Why do I have to individually select which spells I want to use in order to upgrade my skills? Can't I just do multiple ones at once? Why does the game give a nod to the main series via a cover mechanic when plowing through enemies is always the best strategy, and cover is basically useless? New ideas are mentioned but rarely used. Case in point, one of the earlier missions gives a brief tutorial about long-range cannons in a level devoid of these cannons. It introduces a new type of enemy in a map where that enemy never appears, and rarely makes an appearance in later ones, in a game desperately in need of enemy variety. To compensate for the constant visits to the same handful of maps, did I mention that this game recycles a lot Revolution merely locks and unlocks different parts of the same map and changes the expected goal. But whereas, say, Fire Emblem Fates make careful changes to present a new challenge to a familiar scenario throughout its trilogy of titles, there's little to the variation applied to the different missions in Valkyria Revolution, aside from the path one takes to complete them, with most of them boiling down to find a base, capture it, then move on to the next one or go to the boss. Presentation-wise, Valkyria Revolution's visuals are as unappealing as its story and gameplay. I should note that I'm playing the Vita version, so performance may differ compared to that of the Xbox One or PS4 versions, which is hopefully the case because the Vita version is an assault on one's eyes.
I'm sure the common reaction will be something along the lines of how the Switch has spoiled us in terms of what to expect from a handheld game's presentation, except that does a huge disservice to the many gorgeous games that were released on the Vita, like TXK, Soul Sacrifice Delta, and Gravity Rush to name a few.
The animation is stiff, and the constant shift from less to more detailed character models, while likely done to preserve the frame rate, nevertheless muddles the already murky visuals, along with the shocking amount of popping and clipping, especially given the slowdown that slips in on occasion. In terms of audio, sound design is only a marginal improvement solely thanks to an immensely well-composed soundtrack, one of the few bright spots among the violent boredom that encompassed this revolting revolution. What else would you expect from the composer behind the Chrono games? There's not much to say about it, other than the fact that it's a shame that such an exquisite set of tunes is attached to this festering, flaming carcass of a game, certainly one that wouldn't drown them out, with the same puddle full of quips repeated with every attack, and a cavalcade of unspectacular sound effects drowning out the background music. While the rating certainly did them no favors, the voice directing is below Atlus's affairs, which is to say that most of the performances, despite the talented VAs who gave them, range from decent to middling. The same cannot be said for the attempt at lip-syncing.
I don't know the details, but the commanding officer himself said the death toll is far below estimates. The commander is calling this operation a decisive victory.
With 2017 being so fantastic a year as it has been for video games, there is absolutely no reason to spend your time and money on this unmitigated disaster. Even if you're a hardcore Valkyria fan, there is nothing to be gained from subjecting yourself to this misery-inducing experience. It should be avoided like the plague. Valkyria Revolution earns a 2.5 out of 10. That's all for now, folks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to engage in a little cleansing of palate, shall we put it. After that, the Persona Western retrospective. Hopefully. But, until that fateful day, game on, my friends.